Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Wednesday webinar presented by the AOF. This is the number 6 in the series, and we've had good attendance to date, but this is probably the largest attendance we've had to date, which I guess is an indication of the importance of this topic to the broader oilseeds industry. And today we're very pleased to have a guest speaker who's going to give us the depth of insight that we really try to get a grasp of in Australia onto the New Zealand dairy feed market. We've spoken for many years and in fact traded for a number of years with New Zealand for canola meal into the dairy market, but perhaps what we really are looking for is that really much deeper understanding of what the drivers are for that feed market. So it's with absolute pleasure I introduce to you Stuart Davison. Stuart is with NZX. You'd be familiar with NZX, many of you would be. It had a presence in Australia here with Australian Crop Forecasters. Stuart's the dairy analyst, and he will be taking us through for the next 30 to 45 minutes on the dairy feed market. And I'll just let you know that we are recording this, and this will be available for review and pre-review on the AOF website in the next day or so, as is the case with many of the webinars that we've run. There'll also be the opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Stuart. You are all on mute, but you do have the provision to unmute yourselves, but we'll try to retain questions until the end, but also feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Over to you, Stuart.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Right, I'll jump in now. I'll just share my screen quite quickly and get into this. Right, everyone can see that?
Yes, that's all good.
Beautiful. Right, we'll jump into it. We'll try and keep this reasonably brief. I work quite well answering questions, but obviously I think this is quite a new topic for you guys. And the New Zealand dairy system is very intricate and odd. Dairy on the whole globally is easy to understand, so New Zealand's system is very unique and makes it very difficult for outsiders to kind of gauge properly. So we'll bounce through some things. There's going to be questions. Let's do them at the end. But like I say, if there's something urgent and you're burning at you, pop it in the chat and we'll see if we can answer as we go through. But happy to bounce back through it later on too. So a bit of background about me. I am an ex-dairy farmer. I share milk, so I owned the herd. Someone else owned the land. And was a hands-on dairy farmer for 8 years after a degree down here in Lincoln. That I was farming in the Waikato, so in the North Island. I recently, a year ago, moved to Canterbury, so I'm in the South Island now. I work 100%, well, let's say 95% remote from the Auckland or Wellington office where NZX is based, so I'm very privileged to be able to work from home. However, I don't get the lattes or the flat whites every morning, so there's a few drawbacks. Right, we'll bounce through this. There we go. So the key 3 things we're going to touch on the New Zealand industry: the size, the importance of New Zealand to the New Zealand economy, and the dairy processes in New Zealand to sort of shape how the industry is within New Zealand. So the size of New Zealand dairy, we're little players, but we're big hitters. So we only provide 3% of the global dairy production. We're the number 7 in the largest producer, but we're the largest exporter. We provide 30% of the global dairy trade. That's across all dairy commodities. China is currently our biggest destination, taking 40% of total exports. That's really risen sharply over the last 10 years, as I'm sure you're all aware. We do export to every region globally still. Obviously, that mix of exports changes depending on demand. Australia is actually one of our key markets for food service goods such as cheeses and AMF butter. To put the size of New Zealand dairy into proportion, remember we've got 2 islands in the country, 2 main islands. The North Island, just to understand the skew, 58% of the national herd produces 55.5% of New Zealand's milk solids. The South Island, on the other hand, has 42% of the national herd produces 44.5% of New Zealand's milk solids. And it's really key to remember those 2 figures to understand the geographical differences between the country and how the climate affects those 2 production regions. The size of New Zealand dairy to the economy. So $10.2 billion in GDP. Most of that's in dairy farming and a third of that's in dairy processing. New Zealand dairy is the biggest export sector in New Zealand, 20 billion of exports, or 34% of total exports. Whole milk powder, so literally milk straight through a dryer and a plant, makes up 38% of exports. It's our key export, obviously, and it's what derives our milk price. So when whole milk powder is going up, we can assume safely, usually, that the farm gate milk price for dairy farmers in New Zealand is tracking up also. Milk fats make up 17%. Milk fats is butter, AMF or anhydrous milk fat. AMF is what goes into processing, so into manufacturing of Mars bars or food goods, stuff that goes through a process and needs milk fats. AMF is where it goes. Usually gets sold in drums, whereas butter gets sold in 500 kilo packs. Dairy makes up 10% of the GDP of the Waikato, and it's a fairly chunky sort of a thing. And Waikato is probably our biggest region of dairy, 5.3% of Canterbury's GDP, and those are the top 2 regions of dairy in New Zealand. Dairy as an industry employs 50,000 people in New Zealand. That's made up of a majority of that within actual dairy farming, and a good chunk of those in dairy processing and administration. 3.4 billion in New Zealand wages, so it's quite important. Go through the processes real quickly. So obviously, well, hopefully everyone knows who Fonterra is. Fonterra has a presence in Australia. However, New Zealand shareholders, owned by New Zealand shareholders, farmer shareholders, it's still a cooperative and has been since 2001 when it was formed. The market's changed quite quickly in the last 20 years, and to really brush over it, legislation made Fonterra enforced Fonterra to have the movement, the competition, so they had to supply competition to make competition happen in New Zealand. So we went from 94% share to 80% now, and that introduced open country, Synlait, Westland, Tatua, Yili, Oceania, and a few other little processes to come into New Zealand and compete. Interestingly enough, Tatua and Fonterra are the only Kiwi co-ops left. Westland was originally a cooperative, however, 3 years ago they sold to the Chinese, and every other processing company is open country, Synlait, Yili, Oceania. Not majority, well, some of them majority Chinese owned, but they all have a scale of Chinese ownership. So the Chinese ownership is purely to secure supply, and it's not a risk to dairy, but it's a key understanding of where that dairy ends up. So we've skipped through how the milk's processed, what it makes up in New Zealand. Now we're gonna focus on what makes New Zealand dairy. Obviously, pasture-based system. Cows graze out 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on a majority of New Zealand farms. Barns are slowly starting to come into the system. Prevalent in the South Island slowly as environmental factors start forcing them inside. There are places in the Waikato that are using them not 24/7 or for things like heat or soil protection. And so those things are starting to change the outlook of New Zealand, but we're still pasture-based. We rely on rainfall to grow a lot of that rain. However, we do have geographic differences. So we'll run through what a classic Kiwi cow's diet is. Pasture, like we said, is the key ingredient. Now, the one figure I pulled out today is of total dairy farming expenditure, 476 million a year. This is total industry is spent on forage, about 3.2%. However, this doesn't account for the range of systems. This is an average across all systems. So we've got pasture-based systems, and we say a system 1 in New Zealand is where there is no imported feed, and there's a scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and system 5 is 45 to 60% of your feed is imported, and the rest is pasture. So every farmer is different. You can look over your neighbour's fence and see your neighbour's farm and say, that's not how I operate, but the land between you is exactly the same. So the potential of pasture growth is similar, but how you operate your system is usually very different to your neighbour. Supplement is used in New Zealand and ranges in use across the country, and it's very key to understand where in the country a farmer is to understand their supplement or potential supplement use. To lay this out very simply, the Waikato has little irrigation, next to none. However, it grows very good maize, some of the best maize crops in the world, and good grass silage. We also use palm kernel and blends, and we'll touch on pecan blends later on. In contrast, Canterbury Dairy uses irrigation, and Canterbury's rainfall doesn't actually allow for natural pasture production in the scale needed to efficiently dairy farm. So uses irrigation water either out of the rivers or out of wells to grow very high quality grass in Canterbury due to the climate. Canterbury farmers use local feeds such as wheat or barley, to supplement through in-shed feeding or other sources. Interestingly, and we'll touch on this later on, but cannery farmers use a lot of nitrogen currently in the form of urea. A bit of a touch there as well. The whole country actually uses nitrogen to grow grass. It's a key tool for farmers, pasture-based farmers, to grow optimum levels of grass. However, and we'll touch on this later as well, there are a lot of pushback on the use of nitrogen in New Zealand in terms of environmental standards and usage. So, key one to remember. Now, just going through this one, New Zealand's it's a long country. I mean, we've got nothing on Australia. We'll remember that. But it's key to understand how the dairy regions actually work and why different regions demand different feed stuffs and how different farms can operate in different areas. So when we look at the North Island, it's usually wet and summer safe is what we call it. Winters are very easily, we still grow grass through most of the North Island in winter. Northland, so Auckland North, always grows grass, and except for summer. The Waikato always grows grass except for summer. We go below Wellington in the South Island, always grows grass, providing there's water, except for winter due to temperatures. So we look at the far right there, we can see the three zones. Obviously, the Central Plateau in the middle of the North Island is kind of excluded. We do actually do a bit of dairy farming there, but it's a bit of a Goldilocks zone where it's kind of on its own. And the middle one is sunshine hours, which kind of relates back to the pasture growth too. If you look at Christchurch in the middle of the South Island, we see high levels of sunlight, and then contrast that to the rainfall on the left, not a lot of rain. If we don't have irrigation in Christchurch, we don't grow grass. Contrast that to Southland at the bottom of the South Island, lots of rain, not a lot of light, but very good pasture quality, doesn't grow through winter. So very, very different systems through the country, and they all change how each farmer operates. And it can be within hundreds of kilometres, things change drastically. So it's quite hard to put one system across the whole country. So who uses the most supplement feed? This is quite a key one. The North Island on the whole is said to be used the most. It's easy to track because the South Island Canterbury farmers don't actually need to buy a whole lot, and their supplement is irrigation water. They can grow 20 tonnes and harvest 20 tonnes of pasture a year, and they don't need to supplement cows for that. The North Island growth is far more irregular due to dry summers and a lack of irrigation. So that's where supplement comes in, to fill the deficits, or the shoulders as we'd call them. And times have changed over the last, 20 years ago, supplement feed was not as important to farmers on the whole. However, we've actually seen the whole industry change very quickly. So how that's happened and why those factors have happened, we'll go through soon. But North Island farmers use a lot of supplement. The crops are grown in North Island, as we touched on before, maize, whole crop grains and brassicas. However, New Zealand dairy farmers are very conscious of costs and associated returns. So harvestable crops such as maize, very expensive, however high yielding, limited by feed inclusion levels. In situ crops such as brassicas, turnips, weeds, you name it, whatever grows in the ground is easily strip grazed. Farmers are keen on using these. They're generally high yielding, however, as with maize, limits the level of feed inclusion and reduces the area of platform you can use to grow pasture. And pasture is always the cheapest form of feed on a farm, as long as you forget about how much you pay per hectare for your farm. So in the system, pasture is key. However, supplements always needed at some point for most systems. Not many people in New Zealand can profitably run a system 1, so most people tend to operate a system 2 to 3. So some imported supplement. We've seen a lot of intensification of New Zealand dairy over the last 20 years, as I mentioned. This has brought about palm kernel and blends, and palm kernel was a byproduct and was shipped to New Zealand as a trial and took off like wildfire. And it's really become a very important feed to a lot of farmers over the last few years. And now we're approaching the different problem of how we wean dairy farmers out of it. So now we're going to understand how the feed drivers, or what the feed drivers in New Zealand are. And historically, milk price is one of the key drivers. So we've got on this graph, it's a 2-axis graph, so we won't try not to get too confused on this one. The left axis is kilos of imported feed into New Zealand, with the blue line being palm kernel imports. And the yellow bars are milk price. And these are final milk price from Fonterra. Fonterra forecasts its milk price prior to the start of the season and through the season. So often the final milk price is not known until the end of the season. which means that farmers are usually working on a forecast which they make their buying decisions on. So as we can see over the time, 2011 to 2015, palm kernel imports absolutely rocketed. And this was purely reflecting dairy farmers in New Zealand chasing milk price. And like we mentioned before, that forecast in milk price really fell apart in 2015 when China pulled the pin on dairy imports and said no more, and the milk price dropped down to a pretty sore point and hit for 2 years in a row. So the 2014 price was $8.40 plus a divvy, and that was the highest milk price we've seen. And palm kernel imports were very high at the same year. Basically, it was a simple feed to feed, and people knew they could return a profit on each kilo of palm kernel bought through the gate. And with an $8.40 payout, anyone could make a profit that season. The problem was what we found in 2015 and 2016 was that is almost like a drug. People in the industry call it like a drug use. The addiction to the production that palm kernel gave them without understanding where the volatility of milk price was. So a lot of farmers got hurt in 2015 with very high production levels, with very high cost of production, and a very low milk price, meaning that a lot of farmers lost a lot of money. So the guys in the middle between system 2 to 4, those were the guys that hurt because the efficiencies of their system weren't as good as system 1's and system 5's. So we saw in the second year, 2016, the milk price forecast was actually very low. It did actually lift a little bit over the year, and we saw that response instantly with palm kernel imports as dairy farmers said, no, that's it. I'm going back to my system. However, interestingly enough, 2017 milk price was forecast a lot higher, and once again, profit, that production was being chased by New Zealand dairy farmers, and we saw imports of PK just shoot back up. So we get to that point, 2017, for the PK imports going crazy. Milk prices seem pretty solid, but there's a few problems coming down the barrel for Fonterra and farmers. The cheap and simple way to intensify a system helped the farmers. It definitely made their life easier and more profitable, and the ability to carry more cows on the same area of land really helped. The no animals with PK, when you're feeding, there's no real animal health issues like there is with maize. There's no limit to the inclusion you can feed. The cartage and storage of palm kernel is very cheap. However, there's a few properties of palm kernel that really impact its use and future use of palm kernel in New Zealand as well. The bigger one here is the milk was very much affected, namely milk fat composition. The way a cow actually digests palm kernel due to its fiber and oil content means that the milk fat coming out of the same cow is usually very different. So I'm not going to get this right, but it's a different it tends to a different milk fat, which isn't as well processed into butter. So we had a problem with Fonterra in the Waikato and the North Island where butter wasn't setting. Unfortunately, the way that a legacy problem for Fonterra was a lot of the Waikato, where we know we're very prone to dry summers and drought. We have a lot of palm kernel use and all our legacy butter factories. So all of a sudden, Fonterra's dealt with a problem of producing butter that's not setting, and then inhibiting the outcome of what they can produce. So that led to, that's really flagged the problem for New Zealand farmers in Fonterra. At the same time, activists tried to tie New Zealand dairy farmers to the deforestation of Southeast Asia, and Fonterra flagged that again as a problem that market access might be unhinged by these problems. Fonterra came out and said, right, we need to sort this out. We understand the production you're doing of palm kernel is awesome, and that's really good for exports, but if we can't produce the products we need through the factories that we have, something needs to change. So Fonterra came through and introduced the Fat Evaluation Index, commonly known as FEI, to farmers. And what farmers are then, they have control of this level. So it's a factor of the amount of fibre fed to a cow, and it's not only influenced by palm kernel fed, it's also influenced by the amount of brassicas fed, the amount of silage and the quality of silage fed, the quality and quantity of grass fed, and other quantity and qualities of things being fed to the cow. So it's a very good measure of the fat in the milk supplied to the factory. I thought I'd better show you how they measure it. So this is I pulled this up off my phone. This is one of the farms at home, and this is showing yesterday's measurement of FEI quality. And there's a demerit-based system. So if you hit the red level, which is a C, you get a demerit. So you lose a value per milk solid. If you get to the orange, it's a B, and an A is rewarded. So they've just introduced a reward program. And this is very important to compare. So at the moment, the Waikato, where this farm, where I'm taking this recording from, the Waikato's actually got a lot of grass. It's been very good summer, autumn, and things are trucking along really well. Last year, the light blue line, the Waikato was still dealing with the tail end of a drought, and palm kernel and supplement use was very high. And we can see the FEI floating between the A and the B. So it's a constant battle for dairy farmers in the Waikato dealing with a lack of pasture or a lack of alternative feeds to adjust their feed blends properly to achieve an A or B better. And now that there is a reward for an A and a demerit for a C, farmers are far more, they're incentivized not to supply milk that's in the bad areas. So it's definitely working for Fonterra. There was a lot of pushback from farmers at the start, but we've actually seen farmers understand it over time now, and it's not too much of an issue, provided there's not too much of a drought. So the big one in New Zealand at the moment is how we're dealing with these changes. So there's balancing feed deficits and milk production in New Zealand and we're talking New Zealand wide now, is one of the key aspects of farmers day to day. So the New Zealand dairy system is in a rapid change of state. The key drivers at the moment, and I'm sure it's similar in Australia at the moment, environmental issues for New Zealand farmers are key. So I touched on this earlier, that use of nitrogen in Canterbury at the moment and nitrate levels in groundwater and soil nutrient bypass is a real key one for dairy farmers continuing to do what they need to do, and that's farm. So a lot of that becomes a need to feed cows. Nitrogen provides that ability to feed cows, but with environmental regulations coming through, that could be a limit that may force either the change in Canterbury dairy farming and overall the change in New Zealand dairy farming on the whole. There's already a cap New Zealand-wide at 190 kilos of N per hectare, which in the Waikato, for a Waikato farmer, is probably well over their upper end or well achievable. For a Canterbury farmer with most of your season with adequate moisture due to irrigation, an easy level of nitrogen to put on. Capital is currently being constrained in dairy farming businesses in New Zealand, which comes back to their ability to be profitable. So banks, they've gone through years of up and down in milk price and volatility, and farmers get caught short, and a lot of lending has been really tightened up to deal with farmers paying interest-only loans, not actually being as profitable as they say they are on paper. And the banks over the last few years have said, right, the industry needs to change to de-risk. And this has actually forced a lot of dairy farmers in New Zealand to change how they operate because their access to capital is quite limited. Social license to operate sounds odd in the scheme of things, but in New Zealand, it's quite a key one. Dairy farmers in New Zealand are actually faced with this quite regularly, is actually appeasing the local population that we are doing the right thing, and what dairy farmers do day to day is the right and good for the environment, good for the country, good for the people. So that social license to operate is quite important at the moment, and we're seeing, and this comes back to the feed too. So palm kernel is part of that social license to operate, bobby calves, all these things that incorporate into the system that farmers operate are part of that social license. So it's quite a big one for them to get through. However, interestingly enough, and as with every industry, the new generation of farmers are looking to alternative feeds or systems options to provide similar outcomes. Most feeds or systems are either, or feeds in general, at low cost or a good response. So we see low cost or good response as either a high level of protein, high level of oil or fat with a good ME and or a low cost per kilo of dry matter. So the key takeaway there is value. It's always about value for feeding a cow. If a dairy farmer in New Zealand can feed a solid of something and make a milk return that outweighs the cost, it's very simple business. They know they'll take that product. Green, clean, and mean. Profitability, like I said before, is currently the big driver and should have always been, but hasn't always been either. So as we see this new generation coming through, they pull the calculator out more often, and they understand that what they need to feed in return is very important. Now, this is quite an interesting one, and PK, the feed industry in New Zealand is quite competitive. We saw that figure earlier on about the $476 million in New Zealand. I pulled that off Stats New Zealand. I'm sure there's probably a touch more going on through there, but margins on PK in New Zealand are very low. It's considered a loss leader in New Zealand for merchants. So because it's a byproduct out of Malaysia, most of the cost of PK is actually in the shipping. And because it's so competitive, no one can actually charge a dairy farmer more than their competitors, because the contract periods are very short. We can buy spot 3, 6, or 12-month contracts. So it means that a dairy farmer, if he sees a price from a competitor, very quickly swaps over to them, or alternatively goes back the other way. So margins can be as low as $2 a tonne. And we've actually heard, we talk to merchants quite regularly. We've heard of them actually taking a loss to move palm kernel because they've got shipments on the way in. Because the palm kernel is tied to weather, as we mentioned earlier, in the North Island, if it stays wet, farmers tend to stay away from PK because their pasture is obviously more profitable. So merchants have that thing, and they need to move it, but they sometimes take a loss. And when they aren't making a loss, they're not making a very big margin. The thing for PK for merchants in New Zealand is it's used to tie farmers into other blends, so DDG, tapioca, and byproducts. So it's a loss leader for a reason, and like we said before, it's not very high in protein. It's just high enough. It's not very high in oils, and it's not super high in metabolizable energy, ME. So bang for buck's good, but it's not the best thing on the line. So there's a reason it's competitive, and there's a reason dairy farmers think it's okay, but it's definitely not the best thing out. And as this attitude starts changing, we see more people starting to put the DDG tapiocas into their mix because they understand there's a good return when prices are right. Another sort of a myth in New Zealand dairy farmers that's completely wrong is the price of PK is driven by New Zealand demand. It's not. It's driven by the palm oil price and the associated crush. The associated crush. We saw this year with COVID, palm oil producers were struggling to harvest. They were struggling to get stuff on boat due to labour. And we saw that palm oil price spike, and we obviously saw the palm kernel price follow. So New Zealand farmers, there was a bit of a chat that was because the milk price was heading up, and there seemed to be a cartel in New Zealand about palm kernel prices. Completely wrong. It's a byproduct that New Zealand's not actually a big enough market to move palm kernel prices. And I thought I'd better throw some evidence up there. So this is the graph showing the correlation between palm kernel spot price in New Zealand and the palm kernel price in Malaysia. So there's no denying there's a correlation there. I didn't run the correlation coefficient for you, but when we see one move in Malaysia, we know very quickly we're going to see the spot price in New Zealand move just as quickly. So in conclusion, I think I've done well keeping this to a half an hour, by the way. I'll just point that out. The New Zealand dairy is changing and providing opportunities for everyone. It's New Zealand dairy processing on the whole is becoming very competitive. And this is very important when we look at a feed sector sort of thing. Synlait, for example, one of the smaller processors in New Zealand, is very, because they're very market focused, they're very strict on what people will feed. Open country dairy, for example, they're very efficient and low cost. They're not so concerned what their dairy farmers are feeding. They don't have any evaluation on the fat coming through the factory. They just want milk powder. So that's what they rely on. Fonterra, consumer focused as well. They're very willing to change or adjust what people are feeding to make sure the products are right. So competitive process in New Zealand is a very nuanced and a key factor to remember. New Zealand farmers on the whole are changing rapidly as a response to current challenges. As we see, environmental impacts these are leading these decisions. So the government, the councils, levy bodies, and consumer demands are all leading these decisions for farmers. New Zealand farmers are pretty good at trying to resist some of these changes until they realise that it's not the government trying to hand it down; it's usually consumers. PK use is slightly falling, but is very weather dependent. Last year, we actually thought PK was going to fall off. PK imports were going to fall away quite sharply. However, the Waikato and the majority of the North Island entered into a very severe drought through summer, and PK import basically stayed the same. Import data through, for this season, the summer just gone, will be very different. North Island was very nice and wet, good grass growth. However, the South Island's been quite dry, so we're yet to see the actual impact of that import yet. So it is falling on the whole, but not substantially just yet. And probably the big key one there is dairy is New Zealand's key industry. very important in New Zealand. As much as the current government's trying to push the dairy industry around due to environmental regulations, there will never be the complete kibosh of New Zealand dairy, and we do expect it to carry on, however, changing very quickly. Right, that was a very quick half an hour. Very keen on questions. My email address is there. If you need any more information or you want to catch me afterwards, happy to do that. Also, flick me an email if you want to try a trial of our free dairy and grain reports. We do a local grain report in New Zealand covering feed costs, prices, movements, global feed costs. It is New Zealand focused and New Zealand dairy focused. And our dairy reports cover everything that's going on in New Zealand dairy, trade, exports, and the like. So, yeah, flick me an email if you want to know more.
Terrific. That was awesome, Stuart. That was really educational for me, and I don't claim to be an expert or know much about it at all. But I thought, you know, the different feeding regimes across the country, across north-south, and even within the countries, and just the variation that's there and how that drives the different feed mixes, I thought was fascinating. And yeah, PKE has come along to sort of bite them in the bum a bit. So the FEI hopefully will drive a bit more canola meal. Just for context, we used to ship 30 to 40,000 tonnes of canola meal to New Zealand. And that was around 14, 15, 16. So in that dip period, which was interesting. I might ask why that. There's probably people on the line that do know the answer, but I don't. Why our canola meal shipments lifted at a time when the price fell? Yeah, can you?
My guess, if anyone can happy to jump in, I was to say it would have been that season where the forecast was very high to start with, and dairy farmers were chasing production pretty sharply. So, yeah, so like a canola meal, high protein, a really good feed. Dairy farmers know if they want high production, they start throwing that stuff in and they get an instant response. So it probably would have fallen over afterwards due to that sharp decline too. So, and that's the thing, it's that changing attitude. Young guys, such as myself and you know, friends of mine still dairy farming, they understand their feed mixes are far more complex now than, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And, you know, canola and soybean and all these feeds that wouldn't have even been talked about in New Zealand 20 years ago are now commonplace, and they understand the response the cow will give them out of those feeds. So providing the price is right and the milk price on the other side is right too, farmers are keen to get their hands on the stuff. It's just availability and, you know, understanding of farmers in the market to purchase these things.
Great, thanks. Any questions there? There must be some questions coming out of that. Here we go.
Nick Terrence here.
I've just unmuted and go ahead. So Terrence has the floor.
Yeah, so Stuart, thanks for that. It was a great discussion. You mentioned soybean meal right there at the end. How much of soybean meal is being used? And does it have any adverse effects on the butter flavour or composition as well?
Yeah, so I don't actually have, I can pull it up. I'm sure I've got it in there somewhere in my database, but I don't have figures on it. It's a very niche product as well. It's kind of coming in the last few years. I know a few guys definitely use it in the Waikato. However, it's not on the scale. It's due to its price point in New Zealand, it's definitely on the upper end of the price point. So it's not the first one to become inclusion in the meal or the ration, but it's definitely on the list of guys coming forward. And the same thing goes, it's the response they know they get from soybean hull or soybean in the mix, high protein, high ME. They need a low percentage of it in the mix to make a real impact. So that understanding of feed mixes are changing. My wife's actually a nutritionist working for a nutrition company, so she sees that change over time too. And it's quite, like you say, there's not a lot of, at that level of inclusion, we don't see any milk taint or change in composition. But obviously, if you lean too heavily one way, in New Zealand, if you feed too much supplement, we no longer become pasture-based, and that will start triggering the FEI index as well, or with that evaluation index.
Great, thank you.
Any more questions? We've got some meal traders on the line, so certainly they've got some Questions and how we want to take those offline rather than share it publicly.
Well, Rosemary here.
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi, Stuart. Yeah, great presentation. Just wondering, in terms of for the Australian canola industry, you know, how, you know, what would you say? What would you say would be some of the best pathways for us to perhaps, you know, get the increased awareness with dairy farmers in New Zealand around canola meal and the benefits of the bypass protein, etc., that it can have? And you know, obviously, from what you understand, that it's a very much a seasonal driven thing from the pasture-based system. But just wondering if there's sort of suggestions around pathways that we could, the industry, we could do it at an industry level, I guess, communicate to the New Zealand dairy industry to try and get a relationship going to so they better understand the availability and the benefits of Australian canola meal.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one of those things, and I've touched on it earlier as well, that the education around the dairy farmers is changing at the moment, and same as the last question with the soybean. As they understand these things, they're willing to take them up, provided, once they run their numbers on it, then they see the value. So in terms of breaking into the market or expanding on the market at the moment is basically an education piece for dairy farmers. We're entrenched to believe, and it's right, that pasture's number one. That mindset starting to change, that supplements have a place. So it's just educating farmers on the whole that this is what the meal does, this is what this is what the response could be. Like you say, these are the properties that make the value of canola different to something else. And it's one of those things too, and the education piece is market driven too. Canola, for example, isn't deforesting Southeast Asia. That's a key value difference for, say, Fonterra or Synlait in a product that is tied to their product, an input product tied to their output product, which is very important in terms of, Synlait, for example, is a very market-driven, consumer-driven company, and they need those assurances to make sure they keep those marketplace assurances they've already got. So a lot can be done, and I'm sure the uptake it'll be a slow burn, no doubt, as dairy farmers are good to change but slow. But it's just that understanding around the product and what it actually delivers will, in my opinion, will probably be taken up quite well by a lot of guys. The other one in terms of New Zealand feed is there's a lot of big, we've got the ADM and the Grain Corps and all, big companies that run a lot of the importing of PK, and they've got not a stranglehold, but a good control of the importation of these feeds. And so it's breaking in or dealing with those guys that, they have these channels, they have the customer base, they already have the distribution sorted. It might be worth, seeing what the possibilities are with those guys, or compete, or something along those lines. There's a lot of feed brought in, the systems are there. It's kind of how you work into them.
That's great. Just a personal follow-up question then. How influential are the dairy companies? Like, would Fonterra say to its dairy farmers, what's, I guess, again, from an industry perspective, if we work with Fonterra, do they give advice around what feeds are suitable or not suitable, or is that at more at a dairy consultant sort of level, or just?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So Fonterra's in a hard position because they're a cooperative and the farmers own the processor. Fonterra doesn't like to tell its farmers, for need of a better term, what to do. And so there's very much, Fonterra is very good at setting boundaries, like we see with the FEI, and then letting the shareholders operate within that sort of boundary. Fonterra is very good at standing back and not saying what you should feed or could feed, but just providing that. They're very good at sitting in the back and providing the hand on the back and guiding, but not showing. So in short, I'd say Fonterra is probably not the best place to help get into the market. I'd say they're very important to make sure that the product would be accepted by their final product, because obviously that's going to be a limitation at the end of the day. But then the other side of that, it's a hard one. It's probably I'd say the feed merchants or the levy bodies would probably be a good one, to be honest. So Dairy NZ, for example, is the levy body of dairy farmers in New Zealand. Research based, but also obviously they're the guys that come out and say, this is canola meal, for example, this is what it does, and they provide the education. So and dairy farmers on the whole, as a generalisation, trust what they say and look to their research as guidance for their own businesses going forward. So Dairy NZ could definitely be a good point of call to sort of at least your first touch point to go from there.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Great ideas. Maybe we can get Terence, Nick, maybe we can get Terence to look at funding a research project in partnership with.
Oh, yeah, well, Dairy NZ would soak that up in a minute, no doubt.
Yeah, Terence has just walked away from his camera at the wrong time there. Just another question from me, Stu. You said that pasture fed is you're entrenched. You sort of grow up to believe that.
Yep.
And I guess as consumers, we probably would think the same. How much of a key selling proposition is that for your overseas markets? And is there a threshold there that 20% a supplement is okay, or is there a point at which it no longer is pasture fed?
Yeah, bang on, nailed it. And that's so exactly right. So New Zealand dairy is built on the pasture-based system. We're competing with, for example, Irish farmers at the moment are using a market pasture-based on their labelling, and they're outside for 250 days of the year. So that's, in our terms, that's not pasture-based. That's still reasonably barn-based. So very key that New Zealand farmers and dairy are pasture-based to keep that proposition. It's also not just the pasture-based thing in New Zealand dairy at the moment. There's a lot of ethical responsibility and trust in the system. So the outdoor system in New Zealand, the grass pasture-based system, actually provides that that lineage and legacy of trusted pasture-based production for Chinese consumers and EU consumers alike. They understand that those things are tied. So there is definitely an upper limit on supplement to be used within a diet for dairy cows in New Zealand. However, it's on top of my head, it's about 80%. So 80% over the whole season of pasture, you're still considered pasture-based. So obviously we see System 5, which is the most heavily, guys that use the most feed. So it's about 50% of their, 45 to 50% of their total feed is imported. That doesn't mean that at all times of the year, 50% of their feed is import. So obviously we've got a pasture curve. They still tick the box because in spring peak, they harvest all their grass, make no supplement on farm and bring it in. So they still tick the box of being pasture fed, but they have to be, it changes the milk production. So in short, I've probably rambled on there a little bit far. In short, there is always a limit of the amount of supplement to be used to keep that on-label and market access that New Zealand dairy requires to get the prices that it does.
No, good point. So in terms of our total addressable market, our opportunity is 20% of the total feed market.
Yeah, correct. And that's exactly right. But like we said, that change in attitude to feeds is quite massive at the moment. So, and like you say, it doesn't take a lot to convince a farmer that something's better. That value to the farmer of cost per kilo, megajoules, cents per megajoules. And I've got friends and we sit around having a beer and we'll compare costs of feed. So it's a front and center thing for farmers.
Excellent. We'll spread the good word about canola, won't you?
So Nick, I had a question too. Thanks very much, Stuart. I found that very interesting. So where do you see, you might have already touched on it, but where do you see the opportunities are for canola particularly? What are the common circumstances that might occur or from time to time or for seasons that will push canola ahead of something else?
Yeah, or so in my personal experience, so canola, correct me if I'm wrong, high protein, high fat?
Not high fat, so
high protein, so the oil's pressed out of the meal, isn't it? So it's just the protein left in the meal.
You might get between 1 and 10% depending on where it comes from.
So then in terms of protein inclusion into a dairy cow's diet, pre-peak grass growth in New Zealand, so early spring, late winter, early spring, and early lactation, when protein's limiting, and also energy. So canola provides a good level of energy derived from the protein. And then protein in the Waikato, North Island as a whole, limits from about early December, once the grass changes, to autumn when the grass kind of comes back into. So that period is usually about 4 or 5 months of the season where protein is limiting, is a perfect example for these protein supplements to be fed. It also coincides with grass growth limiting as well. So we've got grass growth and protein limited. The normal time where people add supplements, so like I mentioned, in situ grazing of summer brassicas, turnips, or maize crops are usually dropped in those times. Maize isn't a protein feed, turnips are. So and as we see environmental constraints, in situ grazing crops might be phased out. So all of a sudden there's a summer situation for canola meal to be added into in-shed mixes for that protein supplement. So there's a lot there. It's as the industry changes, the opportunities will grow too.
Thanks, fantastic. So are there many turnips fed? So and basically there's not much canola at the moment. You were saying there was whatever.
Sorry?
It's a very small proportion at the moment for canola.
Yeah, correct. And it's the same, like I mentioned before, it's those high-end feeds are definitely coming in, and people are becoming more comfortable with them too. So, and they're understanding that for the same kilo of canola, I get a better response than the same kilo of palm kernel, for example, or maize silage. So as that education piece grows and the environmental constraints change, nitrogen use is restricted, the less pasture we grow, the more supplement we need to produce the same amount of milk. So these things, it's very quickly changing at the moment in New Zealand.
Yeah, and that's great. And so is turnip also a very small market?
Yeah, and this comes down to that thing I mentioned at the start. So one farmer will do one thing, and the neighbour will do something very differently. So when I was farming, I used summer turnips because of the cheap. I was willing to put a fence up in a turnip paddock. Guys down the road preferred to pasture base and buy the supplement in. So it's that understanding that there's very different. Yeah, growing the turnip. Yeah, so in situ grazing. So there's very different markets within, say, the Waikato alone. So understanding how those things change, and the same thing, it's all weather dependent. So a good crop of turnips doesn't happen in a dry year. So a dry year will always create more supplement need.
Infrastructure-wise, mate, how are farmers situated North versus South Island on being able to store like truckloads of meal and the like to substitute, because there's limited infrastructure, isn't there?
Yeah, so this is where we go back to that. The feed guys, in terms of cartage and infrastructure on the feed merchant side, a lot of it, and it's grown really quickly in the last 20 years. And palm kernel led that. It's changed over to these, the other high-end feeds. And on farm, the infrastructure has actually changed very rapidly in the last 10 years. The inclusion of in-shed feeders is what we call them. So each bale of the cow shed, each cow has its own feeder in front of it. A pull on a string, and the feed drops, a measured quantity of feed drops in front of the cow. Not all cow sheds have string. It's also automated. It's becoming more common. It's the inclusion of this technology is partly driven from labour, as labour costs in New Zealand have increased due to minimum wage being pushed up. Dairy farmers cost focused, looking to reduce labour. So in-shed feeding, reduces labour needs. So a lot more guys have taken that up over the last 10 years. Because of that, they've then got infrastructure to store feed delivered by a truck between weekly to 10-day, 10-day intervals. And so that's sort of, that infrastructure then gets forced back to the merchant. But the scale of New Zealand dairy farming, they usually chew through feed pretty quick in times of high need. So not really an issue in terms of long-term storage. However, short-term storage is taken up by the transport and on-farm storage of good quantities.
Excellent. That's a good question, actually. All right, any more questions from anybody on the call? I see Terence has come back, so we'll pick up. The question was put to you, Terence, about funding some dairy research in Australia would you actually see potentially funding some dairy research in Australia and working with perhaps the equivalent levy body in New Zealand, Dairy and Z, to build some arguments for the strength of canola meal in the mix?
Yeah, so we've funded work through
Terence answers. I think Terence, I raised the question, it's Rosemary here.
Okay.
I raised the question, Stuart was saying that Dairy New Zealand would be, one of the, which is sort of like the levy paying organisation over there that supports research. Like JDC, they're very influential in the farmers. So I think it's more whether there's a joint venture activity we could do where maybe JDC can provide some support. But I think, like we do in Australia, we need to use Australian canola meal in the New Zealand dairy system to demonstrate the value and the benefits. So it's sort of using our Australian meal, but it's actually doing research in New Zealand.
Yeah, so we've funded some dairy work with canola, what, Nick, about 4 or 5 years ago? But you're right, that was in Australia. Certainly consider doing something in NZ. Yep, give me a chance to think about that. We'll have a few discussions, and we'll come back to Nick on that one, I think.
Yep. So Stuart, Terence, just for is the levy receiver for the grains industry, is with the Grains Research Development Corporation, Council Corporation in Australia. Any other questions that we might have? We've been going for nearly an hour, and it's been absolutely fascinating, great education for all of us. If there are no further questions, then I'd like to thank Stuart for his time in pulling this together. I think it's been some great insight into the New Zealand dairy industry for us, and is really just the start of the opportunity. I think from an industry perspective, we've had individual companies participating in the market there, but I think it's the opportunity is too good to miss. I think, as you say, the industry is changing quickly, moving towards the opportunity for supplements, and the opportunity for the Aussies industry as a body to be able to work with New Zealand to try to encourage the trade. So we've got one grower ticked off. That's used like tick with one. So we'll just do it webinar by webinar, dairy farmer by dairy farmer, and we'll get there. That was great, and the fact that you are literally on the ground in the thick of it all really adds a lot of strength and credibility to you as a deliverer of this, and to the services that NZX provides in the dairy space. So once again, thanks very much, everybody. And Jackie has a hand up. Sorry, one more.
Oh no, sorry. I was just saying thank you to Stuart as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time, and thanks for everyone coming. And same thing as I said at the end of the presentation. Happy to help after the fact. Emails there in the presentation, and like I said, if you want to take some free reports to have a look, or you know, we're probably not Aussie focused, but you know, the dairy industry is there. And if you want to know more, or you want to see past reports or anything like that, jump on an email or grab a phone number and sing out. Very happy to help.
Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. And the next set of Wednesday webinars will be up on the website in due course. And this will be available, this particular one will be available as a replay on the AOF website as well. Thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.